Program improvements project. So a couple housekeeping items to start off the meeting. These meetings are being run hybrid in recognition that everybody's super busy. So we have folks joining online and in the room. If you need technical assistance at any point during the meeting today, Angela is not with us. So Elliot Eastman is taking her place. You can chat him in the Zoom chat for assistance, or you can text him at 971-600-8861. So if you need any assistance during the meeting, go ahead and reach out to Elliot. Do you want to drop your? Oh, you can. Okay, yeah, you can drop your phone number. So if you have comments during the discussion today, go ahead and raise your hand if you're online, or raise your hand or not if you're in the room, and I'll do my best to call on everybody throughout the meeting. And a reminder that participation in this conversation is limited to work group members. All right, but there are a number of folks who are following along online. And for folks who are following along online, this meeting is being live streamed to DLCD's YouTube channel. And it's also being recorded and will be posted to our website. So if you miss a meeting, you can follow along online. And we do want to hear from everyone. So if you are following along online and want to comment, go ahead and email me at the email address that's posted on the project website or at the top of the agenda for this meeting. Okay, so we've got a lot to cover in an hour and a half today. We may have been a little ambitious with the agenda, but let's do a very quick round of introductions. We'll start in the room and go online. So Elliot Eastman here is pitching for Angela today. And I'm Hillary Foote. I'm the Farm and Forest Land Use Planner for DLCD. Jim?
And I'm Jim Johnson. I'm the Land Use and Water Plan Coordinator for the Oregon Department of Agriculture.
Blair Batson, Staff Attorney, 1000 Friends of Oregon.
Mike
McCarthy, McCarthy Family Farm, Parkdale.
And Tamara Mabet, Morrow County Planning Director.
all the way from Morrow.
But I'm on my way to Eugene. I didn't make a special trip, so hopefully catch up there.
All right. And then online, we have our commission liaison, Barbara.
Hi there, Barbara Boyer, and my role here today is to listen and report back to the commission.
And our community involvement committee member, Artemio.
Yes, Artemio Paz, at-large member of the SEAC committee, here to listen and learn. And I'm a resident on a 40-acre parcel in the Lower Mackenzie area that is zoned F2, and I'm very interested in the forestry-related issues.
Amanda.
Hello, I'm Amanda Punton, and I'm a staff member with the Department of Land Conservation and Development, and my title is Natural Resource Specialist.
And then we'll go to Joy.
Hi everyone, Joy Vaughn. I'm the Land Use and Waterway Alterations Coordinator with the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife.
And Dan?
Hi, yeah, my name is Dan Hubner. I'm a GIS analyst with the Oregon Department of Forestry Planning Division, and I have a particular focus on our long-term land use change monitoring project. And our lead policy analyst, John Tokarczak, will also be joining us later, but he had a schedule conflict at the very start of the meeting.
Great, thank you, Dan. And Christian.
Hi, Christian Richmond. I grow filberts in Yamhill, Clackamas, and Polk County.
And Ian.
Hi, Ian Sisson, Senior Planner with Clatsop County.
Thank you for being here. Nellie.
Hi everyone, Nellie McAdams with Oregon Agricultural Trust.
And Lori.
Hi, Lori from Landwash Lane County, and I haven't been able to figure out how to put my video on. So.
Oh, oops. Do you want to chat with, and maybe Elliot can help you out with that. All right, well, thank you all again for all of the effort and energy that you have been putting into this project. I really appreciate your participating in all these meetings, as well as your feedback on the issues that is going on between the meetings. All right, so let's get right into it. So as a reminder, the goal for this process is to identify actions to improve the functioning of the farm and forest zoning-based conservation program. So we're looking at changes that are going to improve consistency of implementation and clarity of the program in alignment with the intent behind goals 3 and goals 4. And today we're going to talk about issues associated with the definitions of agricultural lands and forest lands, as well as the data that is used to identify those types of lands. And so this conversation is important not only for how we identify and inventory lands to be protected or unprotected, but also for certain non-resource uses that are permitted on lands that are protected under exclusive farm use or forest zoning. All right, so I'm going to start off with providing a little bit of an orientation to the definitions, and then that for some reason I don't have screen sharing capability. So we'll do it in a second. So we're going to start off with the definition of agricultural lands, which is a 4-part definition. And the first part of that definition is soils based. It's based on capability classifications for certain soil types established by the Natural Resource Conservation Service, or NRCS. So this was really meant to be clear, objective, black and white way to identify agricultural lands. And the great thing about that component of the definition is it's agnostic to, and the capability or the ability of an individual farm operator, their business acumen. It's also agnostic to trends in the agricultural economy or agricultural markets. So land that meets that definition of agricultural lands based on soil capability is agricultural land per se.
Mhm.
Not sure why that's doing that.
Right. So I pull up this on this.
Yeah, it's not in the folder though. It's in my C drive.
Okay, that computer's on.
Yeah, no, apologies for that. Not sure why that's doing that.
No.
We won't look at it. Okay. Okay, so end of story. If it meets that capability classification, it's agricultural lands. I'm going to stop my share and see if that is the.
No, one sec, okay, so. Yeah, I'm not sure how to get to it without causing it. So is C drive not something we have?
It's fine, but it's just replaying, I think, the YouTube video, the live stream, which does lag this meeting. Sit there. Muted. All right, that should fix it.
Here we go.
All right. So again, to recap, the first component of the definition of agricultural lands, scientific, sound, it takes, an individual farm practice and market conditions out of the equation. The second component of the agricultural lands definition is, land that is otherwise suitable, land not in those capability classes that might otherwise be suitable for a farm operation. So this could be land in lower capability classes suitable for grazing or viticulture or something like that. The third component of the definition of agricultural lands centers around land that is needed to permit farm practices on adjacent or nearby agricultural land. So the example I like for this is in Tillamook, where there are a lot of dairies. They need to empty their liquid manure holding tanks during the wet season, and they need to spread that on lands, grow silage, and they're kind of agnostic as to the capability classification. And the last component of that definition is lands that's interspersed within a farm unit that may be of lower capability classes. So I think of this like a habitat where you don't want it to be fragmented, just because there's little pockets of lower capability soils. And those are all good locations for things like barns, silage bunkers, agricultural workforce housing, etc. All right. So 3 things that I really wanted to point out here that are relevant to some of the issues that were brought up. The first one, and this is an issue that I think that Thousand Friends has raised, is that the rule and the Goal 3 definition of agricultural lands refer to the definition of farm use in 215-203. And that's a definition that revolves around the intent to make a profit when you engage in that farm use rather than an agricultural use. So that's going to come up later in the conversation. So I wanted to point that out. The second thing I wanted to point out is that this definition of agricultural lands encompasses a huge variety of agricultural practices. So whether it's cropping, dairying, grazing lands, rangelands, it's all included in some component of this definition. So we're also going to talk about that a little bit more today. And then the last thing, which is a great segue that I'm going to draw your attention to, is at the bottom of the Goal 3 definition. And that is where it says more detailed soil data to define agricultural land may be utilized by local governments if such data permits achievement of this goal. All right, so there is a big reliance on NRCS soil capability classifications in the definition of agricultural lands and then a number of other uses that are scattered, throughout the Goal 3 program. And that's a good segue into the soils program. But before I go there, Jim, we're scribbling furiously. Did you want to say anything more about?
No. I'm just for my own use.
The definition of agricultural lands. Okay. So that brings us to the soils program. This was established by House Bill 3647 in 2010. This language here in 215-211. So before that time, when an applicant wanted to challenge the designation of their land as agricultural land, or had a review that centered around the definition of agricultural land, like a non-farm dwelling, an applicant would take some documentation to a county and say here. So the intent really behind 3647 was to create a standardized program for the oversight of the type of information that could be used as basis of fact in a land use proceeding that considered the definition of agricultural lands. Okay. So the rules that implement this program are in 660-3330 and 660-3345, and they sort of spell out in great detail what I'm about to summarize in like 2 seconds. So now if somebody, a potential applicant, wants to apply for a zone change for a non-resource designation, for example, or a non-farm dwelling, they will look at a list of DLCD approved soils professionals, pick one, and hire them to conduct a site-specific soil survey. And that soil survey has to be conducted in a certain way, and that soil professional will produce a report that contains certain information. They'll give that back to the landowner, then the landowner will apply to DLCD for review of that report.
Hillary, is this the current system
This is
you're
the
outlining?
current system that I'm talking about.
Okay.
This is a part of my job. So that person provides that report to GLCD for review. When that report comes to me for review, we are reviewing it for completeness, that it contains the information it should. DLC does not have the funding or the technical expertise to provide a technical review to determine whether that individual report is sound and scientific. The way we do that in the program is through sort of a series of peer review of reports, and by requalification, checking the qualifications of the individuals authorized to prepare those reports on a schedule. Okay. So soils challenges. So we've received some public comments on the soils challenge program to date, so I'm going to bring that up. Sort of questioning the design of the program, expressing concerns around the scientific and technical nature of the review. Also around the lack of clarity. So when this goes to, when it's released to a local jurisdiction for use in a land use proceeding, that local government does not have to consider the report. Yeah, it's available for them for consideration. So there is some lack of clarity around how local jurisdictions might treat that report in the proceeding. And there's been some questions brought up of soils reports being used for reviews associated with something other than a consideration of land as it meets the definition of agricultural lands. Okay. So there's a number of questions that have been raised there. Let's come back to those because we were gonna talk about some other niggledy questions. Typically, soils challenges are applied to zone changes and non-resource dwelling reviews. And so we're gonna talk about non-farm dwelling reviews, and then talk about some of those broader issues associated with the program. So Jim here was actually part of the working group that created that program. So is there anything else you wanted to say as a matter of background about it?
Sure. This actually follows a program that was actually established by the state legislature for lot of record dwellings, where instead of this going to local government, it's actually a lot of records were reviewed. The soils reports were reviewed by the Department of Agriculture. Then we would forward that on to local government. And besides who would do the review, that we could deny. It wasn't just looking to see if they were complete or not. We could determine whether or not it was sound and scientific, and basically the determination. It is expensive. It still continues to exist at ODA, but because it's tied to a lot of records that have a date to it, there's a finite number of those that are out there. And I don't think we've had an application in about 2 years now. Early on, we were probably doing 15 to 20 of them a year in the early days of a lot of record with Measure 3749. So the big difference between what we do or did and what DLCD's rules are is who reviews it and the fact that it can actually be determined to be not sound and scientific. And so that ends it right there in a situation. When we discussed those types of things with the Rule Advisory Committee for DLCD's rules, and it kept coming down to the department not having the resources, keeping it into local review and the like, and those are still the big issues. Who does the review? The other issue that I get calls on about this is what if someone wants to dispute that, but they're not allowed access to the property to, the public involvement in this determination, it's all one-sided. There's really not an availability to question or get out there and actually do your own test holes or the like. And that's been one of the biggest issues that the Department of Agriculture hears about the DLCD process as well. that soil scientist is biased towards this person or whatever. We don't have a chance to go out there and do, to do our own review to dispute this and the like. And that tends to be the biggest issue. And that's important because there's probably only about 5 people in the state of Oregon that meet the minimum qualifications to do these reports. So you're seeing the same people time and time again. And a lot of them are used by the same consultants and the like. So whether it's true or not, transparency is a real issue there. So.
Credibility.
Credibility, yeah.
All of those are issues. So on the matrix, there are a number of issues that are related to soils challenges associated with non-farm dwellings. So we're going to talk about 4 non-farm dwellings outside of the Willamette Valley, the presumed suitable standard. We're going to talk about human altered, human transported materials and reviews, and then the question of whether non-farm dwellings are subject to the soils challenge process at all, which has been a long-standing topic for me. All right. So the first question that was brought up is related to the non-farm dwelling test for dwellings outside of the Willamette Valley, including in Eastern Oregon. And a portion of that test that says that if the property or portion of the property are predominantly composed of soils that are in class 1 through 4 in Western Oregon, 1 through 6 in Eastern Oregon, then it's presumed suitable. So the issue here is that the language is presumed suitable and not shall be considered suitable, or shall be suitable, or is suitable. And so several counties interpret this as allowing an applicant to still demonstrate that the area is not suitable despite its capability classification. So I think, Blair, you had some questions about this particular item, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, I just question. I don't think that the soils assessment program applies to non-farm dwellings.
Right.
Period. There's not, and I will go broader. I mean, you're starting with non-farm dwellings, which are actually kind of a smaller issue than the rezoning. But this statute was adopted in response to 2 programs that the legislature authorized. And one was the Big Look, which those of us who've been around a while remember, and also regional problem solving. And those were 2 programs the state legislature specifically designed, in addition to periodic review, which for some reason is no longer funded, where a county can go by on a county basis or a regional basis and go, things were acknowledged that were a mistake. That this was acknowledged wrong the first time. And I think that and the question of how you would assess the soils or whether the soils were improperly done within that context. I do not think there's any legislative authorization to question NRCS soils determinations on a case-by-case basis, either for non-farm dwellings or for zone changes. I think when LCDC adopted this rule in response to 211, there's language in there that goes much broader than what the legislature said, and I think it's wrong. I think it needs to be corrected. And I think it's creating problems. So that's all the blah, 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 but the policy is what is really happening. I think will always happen is if you have in the program an opportunity for a landowner who wants to seek non-farm development on land that's been designated agricultural land, they will have the motivation to hire somebody to go find a more detailed source information that the county doesn't have the ability that they're planning to challenge that. They don't have any help from the state, any technical help. You kind of sign off. The people who live in the area who know that soil is good quality as all the rest of the soil don't really have a chance to get in there and fight. And if they do just testify, the county commissioners may feel more of an obligation to the applicant than they do to the opponents. It's approved, then it's reviewed at LUPA and it's substantial evidence question. So basically the paid soil scientist report will always stand. So it's going to go one way. So yeah, I just think it's flawed. I think it needs to get out of that process because there's no, I can't see a way. So what I do think is I think if counties feel that or whole regions feel that there's land that's in this zone, they've brought that issue to the legislature. The legislature has said, here's a process for adjusting it. Let's do that process, right? Rather than this case by case, we're just gonna keep, like you said, I mean, there's areas, any agricultural area, even in the Willamette Valley, but particularly outside the Willamette Valley, it's gonna have islands and rivers of less valuable soil or less productive soil. And if that's all open for non-farm development, you've undermined that third component of goal 3, which is to protect lands that are intermingled with and also necessary for adjacent farmland. It's not good policy. So I just would like to see it kind of get a more sensible policy.
So, yes.
Yeah, and maybe to add on to that, 'cause what Blair says made me think of something. When you look at the fact that the legislature specifically authorized this type of thing for one single use, lot of record dwellings, but didn't authorize it for other specific uses, it could be argued that if the legislature intended that for other uses, they would have called it out as opposed to being silent on it. And that's usually an issue that comes up in court. You know, something is by silence, it's not authorized, as basically. So that would be interesting to look into that a little bit too. So, and even then, even when you have the experts involved, you said something about local government's decisions. I've been involved in a couple of cases where the state of Oregon has participated, and we've said something is resource land, but the county still went along with the soils report from the consultant, even though the state experts disagreed with that. So.
Yeah, that happened in Deschutes County.
Yeah, I don't know what the solution is other than totally getting rid of that test. Is there any way, any middle ground where the applicant could make, or the county could hire an expert and the applicant could pay for it if there was any question?
Like a third party.
Well, you know, we had that discussion in the rural advisory group, and the counties just didn't want to go there. They didn't want to manage that. I'm not saying all the counties were that way, but the participants in that work group were that way, and so were the property rights folks. They didn't want to go that way otherwise. But you know, the third party thing gets to the credibility thing, gets to the unbiased type thing and the like, and that's kind of why the legislature had ODA doing those for a lot of records kind of thing. So, you know, we had to hire a soil scientist, but yeah.
Okay. So one option would be to request funding to have a program that's more like ODA's program. Now, another approach where, you know, DLCD would have the funds to hire independent review of every single application that came through. We had 45 last year.
Oh.
And
It's 45.
soils request raises last year. We've gotten 20 in this year. So far, so way down from last year. Every single one of them this year has been for a non-farm dwelling.
And let me add one other little thing here about your having 40 of them. When we started out doing our reviews, we had probably, you know, more than that the first couple of years, whatever. As soon as the word got out that ODA was looking at these very closely, and we actually denied some, that dropped real fast. So they knew that they were being reviewed, and like, I mean, we had people saying the soils had changed because a gravel operation was going in, or gee, because a road's going through it, and like, and we just said that's not a soils criteria, you know, kind of thing. But the county had said it was.
So that's a good segue into the sort of like one of the other questions. So on the whole question of whether, you know, the program should apply to non-resource dwellings or it should be limited to zone changes and non-resource designations, and whether that process should be done at the countywide level or on a site-by-site basis. Those are all, you know, questions that come up. And I just wanted to say that when we did our rulemaking for 3330, that's on the screen here, and added that sub-B component, like, and I understand that this was controversial, that there were some people in this room that disagreed with that, that it was, you know, the sort of the agency's understanding, LCDC's understanding that we did not inform at that time. So the request would be for LCDC to revisit that and take another look at that. That's in the rulemaking record. So Jim brought up something roads and gravel quarries. So something that we see in the soil reports are called human altered human terrain. And I've got a quote in the NRCS soils manual that describes what that is. It's like soils that were intentionally and substantially modified by humans for an intended purpose, commonly for terraced agriculture, building support, mining, transportation, and commerce. By definition, HAHT soils have profound and purposeful alteration occur on landforms with purposeful construction or excavation. The alteration is sufficient magnitude to result in the introduction of a new parent material, human transported material, or a profound change in the previously existing parent material, human altered material. HAHT soils do not include soils with incidental or unintentional superficial changes due to standard agricultural practices or the shallow incorporation of artifacts through flapping. So that's the definition in the NRCS manual for that. And so this is something that's showing up frequently in soils reports that are being used for non-resource dwellings as well as for
High value farmland determinations.
for you too. Yeah. And so, and it might seem like reasonable if something was a quarry in 1940 or 1950s and the land was degraded. But we've also seen this where those alterations were more recent.
I'll tell you what our position was on this, and we worked with NRCS to understand this better. If it was human altered, then it was a self-created situation, and you could not utilize that to diminish the acres of high value farmland soils, for example, thus make it not high value farmland, or to change the soil determination. If it was naturally altered, so let's say Mount St. Helens covered the ground with a bunch of ash, then yes, that was a definite change in soil type or whatever. But human altered, that was, if you authorize that, I mean, I remember early days in the planning program, people would cut down Christmas tree farms or cut down orchards and say, there's no farm use here, see, it's all, even though 2 weeks earlier there had been, kind of thing. It's the same kind of situation.
And so this can become important, especially in a non-farm dwelling review, where you're looking at the suitability of that area for farm use. And when you have human altered terrain and they have been altered to support agricultural related facilities like barns or silage bunkers or cattle lanes, those are sort of areas that by definition are considered to be in farm use, right? And so I think it can become very tricky from a review perspective to, distinguish farm use human altered terrain suitability review from, terrain that may not have been in conjunction with farm use, like a quarry, for example.
And even then, the quarry had to go through a process. And so that was our thinking, okay, they took an exception, they went through a process for that quarry, or even pre-existing. A lot of those pre-existing ones started out as agricultural borrow pits, for example. But so we just did not recognize those as reasons to change the soils classification, because it was an intentional change. They made a change in land use that was intentional as opposed to a natural change
in the land. So there's no guidance though in our rule to help the county understand how that might be treated differently or should be treated differently if there's part of a soils challenge that identifies that as a lower capability class area in that sort of suitability test flag of a non-farm dwelling. And so that's identified as another area where if, our commission wanted to, apply this process to non-farm dwelling reviews, do some clarification.
Yeah, I would just, from the practical side, get to stand on the other side of the counter. Clarification would be helpful. It might be very unpopular, but clarification would be helpful.
Were there any comments, online on this topic? I'm not seeing raised hands, but I'm not quite sure if we're missing something there. Christian?
Yes, thank you. I just had a couple comments going back to the definition of high value farmland and non-farm dwellings. I second the calls for clarification. And I think with regards specifically to the high value farmland definition, having a uniform definition would be desirable. I think that the greater clarity is helps everybody involved. In terms of the non-farm dwelling standard, I think that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. I think there's a standard pre-1993 or 1994 that is consistent with the principle that the whole parcel has to be unsuitable for farming, not just part of it. And that if there's just, again, in the spirit of clarity, no more farm dwellings, no more non-farm dwellings. But maybe Jim or Blair can speak with more knowledge about this pre-1994 standard.
Well, I do remember that. It basically, this goes back to when I was a county planner, and probably at DLCD. It used to be that you had to determine to authorize a non-farm dwelling that wasn't a new land division, so it was just on a parcel, that the entire parcel had to be unsuitable for farm use, not just a portion of it. Because if you just go by the portion, you could have 100 acres with 5 acres over on the corner that's a rock pile. You put the dwelling out there, you probably just lost the entire 100 acres of farm use because you put a non-farm dwelling on there and the person doesn't want to farm it. Kind of thing. And so you've got to look at the entire parcel to determine the suitability and the capability. Those are two different terms, by the way. Capability and suitability aren't the same. Because it's basically shadow conversion. You put a non-farm use on a parcel, the chances are that parcel is not going to be utilized for farm use, or is going to be utilized at a much lesser intensity than what a benefit was of farm use. Now, suitability versus capability. Capability is the ability of land physically, regardless of any other constraints, physically to be used for farm use. So the capability of the east bank of the Willamette River in the city of Portland is class 1 prime farmland. It's very capable of being farmland, but it's not suitable for farmland because of other constraints and the like that's come on there. And the suitability standard is where you look at beyond the soils or the water. You're looking at other things like conflicting land uses, shape, configuration of the parcel, things that would restrict the ability for it to be farmed. That gets to the suitability side. Capability is really very narrowly focused on the soil and water situation. Suitability to me gets to into the ability to farm kind of thing. One's the ability to farm, one's the physical capability to farm.
Well, I agree, it's better. The pre-1994 policy I thought was better. I think it helped to know that it was a political give. The LCDC at that time made the decision to greatly restrict non-farm dwellings in the Willamette Valley, but eased the criteria outside the valley. And I think it's just a trade-off. And I think at that time, there was probably less development pressure than there is now in parts of Eastern Oregon. So I just think it should be revisited. I think it's bad policy in a way. I think it's just a political trade-off. I don't think it was related to how are we going to preserve these agricultural lands. So
I have one other issue in this area too, but I think.
Oh, I was just going to say, I remember that's when Jim and I met in 1993 or 94 implementing 3661. And it was, again, from the practical side, the local side, it probably was a political decision at Salem, but it helped local planners sell the program because we could carve out these little pieces instead of a blanket can't develop unless you have 240 acres or 160 acres. So I think it's, I might not personally disagree with you, but I think that the trade-off it had to garner more broad support for the program was really valuable. Now, clarifying when and how we apply those so we're consistent, that I would very much.
And land divisions versus a non-farm dwelling on an entire parcel are two different issues too.
Very different things, yes, yeah.
Because 30 years later, I mean, is that changed somewhat? Meaning there's more pressure. I know where you are, but it's like, for example, in Deschutes County. And
well, the EFU reports show us that there's been a big difference when you look at
a lot more, for sure, for sure.
And it's Yeah, it's converting some areas, right? So it's
Oh,
just
a series of, but then are
Cumulative
you,
impacts.
it's the cumulative impacts thing that
Right.
maybe is what we need to look at, and that's kind of all over the place the way. I mean, it's not as consistent as some other things.
And I think we talked about that earlier in this, when we talked about how to, if we can better define the overall stability of the land use pattern criterion, which is supposedly the cumulative impact.
Okay.
Which applies only to non-farm dwellings and not all the other non-farm uses, coincidentally, which is really interesting.
That is interesting. I think putting together a matrix of these things would be super helpful. which
So
we
what we're
really
still
only
on,
do.
what we're still on high value farmland that was brought up by Mike. This has been an issue that I've talked to a lot of farmers and ranchers around the state, and they don't have a problem with the restrictive standard for non-farm dwellings in the Willamette Valley, but they think there are some other high value farmlands outside the agriculture, outside the Willamette Valley that might be not considered, that are high value for other reasons that should also have the same, afforded the same protection. You go to Morrow and Umatilla counties or whatever, there's some soils out there that are class 6, put water on them, they become prime. And you're seeing those circle pivots and like out there, you're seeing those big dairies out there and like, that's not high value farmland by definition in a lot of cases.
By the soils definition.
By the soils definition or by the what, but yet the farmers will tell you it's some of the most productive farmland in the state on an acre by acre basis. And they would like to see the same protection afforded to them as high value farmland, not just for dwellings, but also for all the other high value uses that are, that are not allowed for, kind of
Such
thing.
as renewable energy.
Well, or the one that always comes up
Utility
for me is
facilities.
golf courses, are not even allowed on high value farmland. for
And
example,
schools and that.
in the country. So,
Uh-huh.
so
If we're gonna talk about high value farmland, there's two very different definitions.
Mhm.
Well, they're not very different. There's the definition, the older definition that is soils based. High value farmlands, that's in our rules, 660-33-20 sub 8. And that is, defines certain soils classes that are considered high value farmland, prime, unique, class 1, class 2, irrigated, not irrigated, land planted and perennials, and then it goes through a variety of different, soils that are also considered high value farmland, whether you're in the Willamette Valley or you're on the Oregon coast. Then there is another definition of high value farmland at ORS 195-300 that was created for Measure 49 that is much more expansive. So it takes that as its base and then expands it upon it and includes land that has a certain slope aspect. If it's in American viticultural area.
the biggest and most important change though is the irrigation.
And it also looks back to see if a property was irrigated or within the boundaries of an irrigation district at a certain date and time. And if it was, then it's considered high value farmland. As well. So those are the biggest ones associated with 195-300 definition. The 195-300 definition applies to most of the post Measure 49 new uses and changes that applies to golf courses, solar projects, and UGV expansions.
So the 195-300
Yeah,
applies to golf
basically-
courses.
Basically,
solar
any
projects,
new changes to the uses list in the EFU zone since 195 was adopted. That they now use 195 for that. So like when they made the change, gosh, I don't know, about 5 years ago or something that involved, they were discussing golf courses. They basically said in statute, golf courses are not allowed in high value farmland as defined in 195. Whereas before that, they would just say it's not allowed on high value farmland.
So what was it, golf courses and solar?
Golf,
projects?
I'd have to go back and look, but
Golf courses, solar, urban growth boundary expansion, and some of the
there's one,
pilot projects.
yeah, there's one other thing.
Okay.
whatever.
Like the Pendleton pilot.
But every
project.
time there would be a change in that, yeah, every legislative session, there's always, there's being some new use added to the list or new criterion added to it or something like that. Ever since that changed, the legislatures always went to 195 now. And so that's why we got split, not only two different definitions, we got split of uses that go different directions, even though,
Is it possible to chart this out mean, I'm a planner, so it's so hard to follow, like, like a bubble chart or whatever, that these uses are, I was literally at the planning commission last night talking about, they were going to add some standards for solar siting, and they were asking about how do you know if it's high value, and solar has its own set of standards. And I know we're not talking about renewable energy here, but if I didn't have your chart that you put together, it'd be really hard to figure it out. So I use it all the time. And now we need a new one, right? Face it, yeah.
Right, so yes, so we could provide more guidance on how you evaluate land under 195/300.
That's right. Yeah, that's what I would be
It can
asking.
be challenging for some folks to find some of those data sources. It definitely requires a GIS analysis.
And you know, in the early days of high value farmland, there was this really this big push for the counties to map their high value farmland. The problem with that is, especially with the 300, the 215/700 test or whatever, is that it's a predominance test. So it's really tract by tract. You can't just go, so the counties have to sit there and continuous ownership and do a predominance test and able to map what that is. It's not that it's not undoable, it's that it's a heck of a lot of work, and that's why most counties haven't mapped it. They do it on a case by case review. If there was some way long-term we could just map that would solve a lot of the problems.
There is a requirement in our rule that counties provide maps of high value farmland at post.
I think that's required along.
Yeah.
Yeah, at periodic review.
Periodic review.
Yeah, periodic review is not mandatory though, so.
So I don't. But part of our recommendation may be, like, we need to get periodic review funded again. It's just because that's where the state can really help the counties get stuff.
Well, like Wasco County did it voluntarily through technical assistance, and hats up to them for doing.
They did,
that.
I was involved in that. They did a great job. They've not really finished it or anything. They've kind of, yeah.
Me and Clatsop updated, you updated your goals for your 4 elements, didn't you? Recently?
Yes, we just completed that. I think they were adopted at the end of last summer.
I also remember, and there was a time when the state provided a list of high value soils for each county. And the reason I remember is Ron Eber and I put that together, but I don't think that's been updated in years, so.
Oh, gosh. In the back of the notebook, yeah.
Yeah.
That would be really helpful to have the soils high value under the 195/300 versus the whatever 215. The other. So we knew, yeah,
But
based on
because
this.
LCDs, I can't LCDC by rule just say all these are high value for all uses. Right, if you want all, right, or is that? So you have a uniform definition of high value.
You know, I'm not, we need to talk to legal counsel about that because the original definition of high value farmland was a statutory definition.
Yeah.
And how it's, so we may have to go to the legislature to do that. So.
Okay, let's look into that. So it would just make things easier.
So expanding that definition.
But LCDCC took that and then applied it to, because LCDC can add additional standards to all the uses in the EFU zone under the, I forget the case, but yeah, but so they were adding more uses that were regulated by high value farmland in a situation like that. But for us to combine the two or whatever, I think we'd have to go to the legislature. Now, remember, LCDC and the counties also have the authority to add more high value soils on the list that they think is our high value farmland. And that happened in Curry County. The Harbor Bench doesn't come out as class 1 or 2 soils or prime, but it grows some of the best Easter lily bulbs in the world and hydrangeas in the world. And we recognize that was really unique soil. And so LCDC basically added that to the list by administrative rule. They can add to
I think they could add these other issues in the other statute too, but we'll talk to council about it, but I don't see how that would be different.
So I'm hearing some support for reconsideration of the definition of high value farmland. in
To make it
20,
consistent, yeah.
like incorporating the provisions potentially of 195-300 under that definition or some components of that definition.
Yeah, if there was only one thing to do on high value, it would at least be have the consistency that everybody's applying the same definition.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And
For
then
all
second
uses.
For all
all
uses.
uses, and then helping the counties get their high value farmland identified. So they don't have to go through the struggle.
But for all uses, can that also include solar? Because it's crazy that we have separate standards for solar. I mean, they need to play by the same rules, I would think.
Ian, did you have a comment on this question?
Not on that question specifically. I just wanted to follow up and say I had to double check, but we didn't initiate any new policies or mapping related to high value farmland in our goal 3 update. I will say as a side note that I've used the Oregon Explorer Measure 49 high values farmland map and high value forest land map, which is handy. It would be great to have something like that that we could use in our analysis. And the web soil survey also is very handy. If there was a tool like that that we could use to do our site specific analysis for high value farmland to determine if it's the predominant type on a given parcel or tract, that would be really useful.
And Ian, this is a great point because a lot of people get confused about this. Those are great tools to identify where the high value farmland soils are. But they don't tell you whether that property is high value farmland because you still have to apply the predominance test. So it'll, here's this big blob of high value soils, but what's the parcelization look like under it? That's where you have to do the work is ownership by ownership, determining whether it's predominantly composed of those high value soils or the like, when that predominance test comes into play. That's why when I talk about soils maps, when somebody says that's a high value, the NRCS map says it's high value farmland, I say, no, it says it's high value farmland soil.
Okay.
Versus that it's high value farm, because you still have to do the predominance test.
And if you're looking under 195-300, there are other factors that aren't necessarily captured on the Oregon Explorer map, just so folks know, like the irrigation district, water rights aren't captured in that. So if you're using that for golf courses, solar projects, urban growth boundary expansions, there's some caveats with that, sort of beyond the fact that that definition is applied based on predominance of the tract. So you have to know what the tract is as well, right? So
This is Lori. I still can't raise a hand. I've tried everything. But here I am butting in again. A lot of this I don't really understand. I mean, I understand it, but we're not a farmland county, but I do have a question based on all this discussion. I presently have I'm presently involved in an appeal where an applicant wants a primary farm dwelling on non-high value soils. That's the proposal. And the soils are predominantly class 3. And Lane County has a soil survey that they use to determine whether soils are high value or not. And so these class 3 soils aren't high value. And then the other soil type, which isn't predominant, is a class 4. I think it's one of the loams, and it is considered high value. And so they don't a primary farm dwelling on non-high value soils where they're predominantly class 3. I was really thrown off by this. And I'm wondering if what Jim was just saying about the underlying, I think the word was used was parcelization, but maybe I misunderstood that. Is what I misunderstood, because I would have, without looking at the soils, Lane County's the soil survey, I would have thought that these soils were high value.
So Lori, when you look at high value farmland soils and you get to the class 3 and 4 soils that are high value soils, they are specifically listed by name in the statute and rules. Not all class 3 and 4 soils are considered high value. So in the Willamette Valley, there are class 3 and 4 soils that are considered high value. There are a lot of class 3 and 4 soils that are not considered high value. That's why they're specifically listed by name in the law. That determination was done back in the early days of high value farmland by working with NRCS and OSU Extension, looking at class 3 and 4 soils that were considered highly productive based on wheat yields, because we could get the numbers for wheat yields, and the 3s and 4s that could meet those criteria for wheat yields were considered to be high value farmland. Wheat was used as a surrogate to measure what it was. There are a lot of other 3s and 4s that didn't meet that, so they're not high value farmland. So chances are, Lori, what happened in your case, it wasn't a matter of the predominance test. It was a matter that the soil, the 3s and 4s in this situation are not high value soils.
So why don't we move on to, the other components of the agricultural lands definition. So there were some comments and questions, about the second, really, and third prongs of this definition, which are and adding some clarity here. So lands that are suitable for farm use based on other factors inherent to that land. So Jim gave a great sort of description of, an example of like what might be suitable for farm use and not necessarily like consist of high capability soils. So there are a couple areas there that were raised during this sort of process. One was tightening of standards for, those factors around defining those factors for suitability. And the other was sort of adding another prong to this definition that was specific to grazing lands as well. So grazing lands and what is and isn't suitable for grazing has become up in a number of reviews. It has resulted in a lot of appeals and conversations. So do you want to talk about that, Blair or Jim?
Yeah.
Jim, let's just do it.
But what I don't mind if you want to go, but this issue keeps popping up. ODA was asked to look into this, gosh, I don't know, 10 years ago or more, related to Measure 37. And what the legislature was asking us, is there a degree of grazing ground that we could treat differently than maybe lower productivity and have that split similar to high value farmland, high value farmland versus other farmland, and grazing, rangeland versus lower productive rangeland. And there are tools to do that. I think this is a very technical issue that I think we need to look into, but I think it's deserving because of the workload associated with it of a work group to just work on that. I will say that in the years that I've worked on this with some range conservationists with the NRCS, and at ODA, we don't have any anymore, but we used to have some range conservationists. And then my experience with it from working on the east side of the mountains as a county planner is that it's going to be more based on the value of forage on the east side, and on the west side, it's going to be based on the value of management. It's because it's more pasture type grazing ground, managed grazing ground, versus on the east side, it's much more rangeland. And so it's going to be two different kinds of measurements, I think. At least that's what it looks like to me. AUMs on the west and pounds of forage per animal unit on the east. And there's ways to determine that using the soil surveys. And the thing is to make that definition, be workable and put into a land use context would take a while. So I think it's a very valid topic. The case that we joined in Central Oregon with DLCD and Department of Fish and Wildlife, we felt that was rangeland, and the county felt that it wasn't. It's a great example of where we need a better definition. There's a lot of resources out there. We know a lot more about rangeland than we did just 10 years ago. The NRCS now has a rangeland and analysis tool, actually a national one where you can get on and look at certain things like that. But there's also ways to look at a soil survey, soils type, and look at the, you know, if anybody that's messed around with the web soil survey, you go in there and you look at a soil type and you look at all the different attributes, everybody always just goes to capability and whether it's prime farmland, but there's so much more in there about ecological units, and it talks about the native forage associated with those economic units and permeability of the soil and on and on, all these different attributes, and those can be combined to start to do ratings on rangeland, for example. And we did that years ago in relation to what the legislature was doing, and then of course they couldn't come up with a solution, so that kind of went away. I'm a pack rat, and so I still have those maps that we worked on. But it's a very technical issue, and it's a very valid issue, but I don't think we can solve it here in this forum.
I didn't write fast enough. This is really interesting. I agree that more clarification would be very beneficial. You said on the west side, it's based on pounds of forage, and on the east side, it's cow calf carrying capacity?
Either the other way around.
Oh.
West side is AUM, so cow, you know, how many units per bill. The east side, it doesn't work so well that way. You've got to look more at because it's really looking at native rangelands and like that may be managed somewhat also. So you're looking more at pounds per forage. And what some people would look at and say, that's just a bunch of sagebrush and juniper out there, a rancher would say, but it sure goes good grass in between that ranch, those junipers and sagebrushes. And that's not going to show up in an AUM rating. It's going to show up in a pounds for forage.
Pounds per forage versus AUM.
Yeah.
Okay. And it might be acres per AUM. Yeah, okay.
Well, AUMs are acres, but
Animal
but on the other side of the coin, it would be how many pounds for forage per acre kind of thing, or whatever. And it's all the great thing about it is ultimately once you do the work up front and the like, you can actually just make an objective standard then, because you'll have these numbers. And so where's the break? If this land is capable of producing X amount of pounds for, you know, this or X amount of AUMs, it's whatever we want to call it.
Yeah.
So you can't, once you do the work, it's an objective standard.
Yeah, I like clear and objective. Makes a lot of sense for sure. Yeah. And it also depends on the rancher, right? And the technique and
No, again, it's based on the capability of the land, not on, you know, I could be a terrible rancher and I'm not maintaining my rangeland in a very good you know, I'm overgrazing or whatever, and then Mike's a really good one. You're looking at the soils type and what is it capable of?
Yes, so I mean, that's right. So we hear arguments based on differing ranching techniques. That's right. So that's right.
When I was at Wasco County, Rancho Rajneesh, when the Rajneeshis first bought it, was so overgrazed you couldn't run two head on it. By the time this is one of the good things the Rajneeshis did. By the time they were done, they had redone that entire management of that rangeland, and it could support all kinds of livestock. So the capability was there. It's just that it hadn't been managed correctly. So you don't want to penalize a piece of land by somebody overgrazing and saying, "Oh, it's not farmland anymore." So you know.
That's right. Yeah. Okay. Again, back to this. Yeah. Okay. Definition.
And I like Jim's idea of exploring it and setting up a DLCD governed technical, because it's highly technical, and getting in rangeland experts because they don't know that stuff. And I know, you know, Oregon Agricultural Trust has a great person, and then the state, the different agencies have people. So I think it can be done, and I think it can be done because it would add this clear and objective standard, which the more we have, the better it is for everybody.
The GIS capabilities that we have now versus what we had 20 years ago is just so amazing that the things we can do now that we couldn't do.
I like this idea. There's two other things I just want to call out. They're sort of related to the grazing lands definition. While we would be focused on the agricultural capability of lands for grazing, there are conversations going out there right now around Oregon global warming commissions, natural and working lands group that's looking at you know, sequestration value of rangelands. So the long-term sort of carbon benefit of rangelands, probably misstating that, and how they're defining that. Institute of Natural Resources defining and looking at that. The report that I most recently looked at called for preservation of rangelands, certain type of rangeland, as a climate practice for consideration. And the other thing is that ODF has this land cover report. Dan is on there as well. That also, I believe, Dan, your report has rangeland as a category that you track cover for, vegetative cover. And I think our work is also based on vegetative cover, but I think it's something that's worth looking into and integrating into that conversation.
So I do want to clarify, our land use report is it's not cover based, it's primarily a broader scale land use assessment. And so to qualify for rangeland or forest land or resource lands in general, for our purposes, it has to be at least a square mile of land that's generally in that use. So it's not great for more parcel scale. Is it range? Is it forest? Because it's just a broader use classification than would be appropriate for that kind of thing. And there are some problems with the rangeland versus forest land on the east side as well.
So I think this could be a really interesting conversation to look at certain data sets that we've used and like how they align, how they don't align, what's for what, and how they can be integrated in this conversation. Mike?
Yeah, I was on that committee for the Oregon Global Warming Commission, and it was very interesting. We got a very good technical group from the Oregon Cattlemen's Association, including the director of the Squaw Butte Experiment Station. And so if we go further down that road, it would be great to get those people involved. They're the ones that actually wrote this technical team from the Cattlemen's Association actually wrote most of that material in the report.
Are there any other comments on the non-soils component of the agricultural lands definition that we want to bring up before we move on to forest lands? Where did you have anything else you wanted to bring up on that?
No, maybe the next meeting we talk about kind of how we're going to what exactly, how's this going to end up looking? Are we making recommendations that go in, and are we, so I know we're doing best because we've talked about these things. I'm not sure where they're all coming down.
They're all going to be captured in the report for consideration. And then we are going to make recommendations to staff or the agency is going to make recommendations to LCDC for how to move forward with addressing the variety of issues with all of these ideas and issues being presented in the report for consideration.
We touched on everything that I was going to keep asking.
All right, so let's move on to forest lands. Okay. So there's a lot of history behind why there is this first component of the definition of forest lands that essentially said land was inventoried as forest lands, then it's forest lands, right? So we're not going to get into that today. Again, there's a great paper by Ed Sullivan that talks about that history, and that's really fascinating. If you're interested in that, I'm happy to send that out. So if there is a zone change that's proposed that involves the definition of forest land, there is additional guidance in our rules at 660.610 that essentially refers to a publication that's been produced by the Oregon Department of Forestry. It has a hierarchy of data to be used in determining what is forest land. So it says that forest land needs to be based on a cubic foot per acre vegetative capability classification linked to the NRCS soil database. And then where that's not available or it's shown to be inaccurate, then other data sources may be used, including the Department of Revenue maps, the Forest Service Plant Association guides, or other information the state forester determines to be of comparable quality. And then if none of that pans out, then an applicant can hire a forester to do like site-specific analysis based on a document that's published essentially by the Department of Forestry. About a year ago, there was a sort of legal memo being circulated in Southern Oregon, essentially calling into question the data sources that were identified in our rules. And so we're bringing this up as an issue for consideration. Dan, did you have comments on sort of the data hierarchy that's presented here and in the Department of Forestry's technical note bulletin?
Yeah, so I don't think I've seen that memo that's being circulated, so I'm not sure what exactly they were calling out as problematic, but
I think I worked with John on it, so I'll forward it to you.
But to the extent that I've worked with this stuff, which is not a huge amount, but you know, it's come up over my time with ODF a few times when there have been these zone change questions, and it's honestly kind of approached ad hoc on our side because we don't have anyone who's like responsible for reviewing these kinds of things on a regular basis. But so the NRCS data is, from my perspective, that makes perfect sense as a first go-to. And there are some technicalities with how you use that in terms of like, there are options about using a weighted average versus a dominant component of map units and stuff like that, which has come up in the past, but that's probably a little too detailed to get into now. But one particular thing there is, so where the NRCS data is not available, that is sometimes taken to mean that it's not productive forest land. And we have consulted with NRCS in the past to verify that, you know, where data is not available in the soil survey, that doesn't necessarily mean it's not productive forest land. It just means data is not available. So you move on to the next step. And then, so then the next step is those Department of Revenue site class maps. But the issue with those is that those are mapped in basically 40-acre squares where they assigned like a typical average site class ranking to that whole 40 acres. So you can see that there are probably legitimate scenarios where NRCS data is not available and that Department of Revenue stuff that's in 40-acre blocks is not accurate for the specific parcel that you're looking at. And, you know, from there, I don't really have a good like go-to answer about how you assess it from there, because those Forest Service Plant Association guides, I've tried to look into that a little bit, and it seems to be, you know, certainly not statewide coverage. I wasn't, if I remember right, I wasn't entirely clear on how a landowner exactly would go about using those. And honestly, it was before my time when that department guidance came out recommending that. So it's basically from the NRCS and the Department of Revenue, where they map that it's productive forest land, that I think creates a strong presumption that it really is productive forest land. But where that data is missing or they're saying that it's incorrect, I don't know what the right approach is, or there's not really a one size fits all or a good answer to when someone's contesting those data sources. So that's kind of where I'm at from the extent to which I've interfaced with this stuff in the past.
Remark about the NRCS. Let me, Dan was pointing out that the NRCS said that, you know, the data wasn't available. Let me tell you why the data is not available. The NRCS historically is an ag associated organization, and in the USDA is the Department of Agriculture, who has the U.S. Forest Service within it, but they've always been kind of focused on agriculture. And how the folks at the NRCS explained to me the fact that there's not forest related capability ratings. It's just this: if it's ag land, we're not going to spend the resources to determine the forest capability of it. Whereas if you go to forest land, they do both ag and forest on that. You can get both ratings. So I remember when I used to get those calls, well, there's no rating, so it's not forest land. I go, if that can grow grass seed, or if that can grow orchards, it can grow trees. It's just, there's just not a rating available. So, and it's just that the NRCS is kind of biased, so to speak. If it's ag land or it's urban land, we're just not even going to determine the forest capability of it. Is what they basically, why you don't see it.
Right, that's totally right. That's what I've seen in a situation in our county, just as Dan was explaining. it was predominantly farmland. So there was no forest rating on it. So they put in zeros in their calculation for forest productivity. And that was for a forest template well. So there's got to be a means to determine what that land can do. I don't like the idea of hiring a professional. There's got to be another way. It's got to be a map thing by the state or something, because I hired a forest professional to do this. And he told me, he said, how do you want it to come out? And it's not the first time that's happened. So I don't trust that method.
And then we have the mixed farm forest zones in lots of Eastern Oregon, so clarification would be helpful.
Yeah, do you apply the forest test if it's predominantly forest use, or do you apply both regardless, whatever, you know?
And it's basically.
I've always told people whatever the predominant use is.
Yes, that's what I was gonna say, but then you might not have data for what seems like what appears to be the predominant use.
So this is, I want to make sure this is often comes up during a zone change, especially during a non-resource determination where there's a challenge to, for somebody who's trying to demonstrate that this land is not forest land and it's not agricultural land. You need to do both for a non-resource zone change. And this also comes up, as Mike noted, in template test reviews where there's no vegetative productivity capability class assigned to the soils on the property. Right. And so template test is, there's slightly different standards depending on the vegetative capability class of the underlying property. Right. And so in some cases, Ken, you will see that 0 for no vegetative capability class assigned to the soils. And so they just go with the lower standards.
Even though it might be prime farmland and could grow anything.
So we provided guidance, sort of referring for a template test where that's the case, where the USDA, the NRCS information is not available. This hierarchy should be followed and then sort of as well for template test reviews. It's in our guidance, but it's not in our rules. Lori, did you have some experience with independent forester reports and reviews for template tests or zone changes in Lane County?
Yes, it's similar to the discussion around professional soil surveyors who do ag land research to show that it's not high value or the soils are wrong in the soil survey. It's a similar problem. There's only in Lane County, the same, almost, there's 2 or 3 people who are hired over and over again. For us, it's a zone change from almost always to marginal lands. And the marginal land stuff is really antiquated. It asks you to look back, like I think to a time before 1993. And it's extremely it's beyond complicated. So Washington County is the other marginal lands county, and Washington County zoned everything marginal. That was just like, counties zoned their EFU and zoned their forest land. Washington zoned their marginal lands. That's my understanding, but Lane County didn't. And they do it on a case-by-case basis. They hire individual soil scientists. Foresters, not soil scientists, foresters, who say that the forest land isn't productive for forest uses. It's marginal, and that is our biggest problem. This case-by-case, parcel-by-parcel analysis, in my opinion, whether it's farm or forest land, it's very problematic. We can't really evaluate the foresters, what the forester evaluated, for example, just like with the farmland. All we can evaluate is whether it looks like his report was valid, and then it's really hard to make the argument that it's not, and there's not really any criteria. And it's a problem. It does, the only thing that stops it from being a huge problem is costs so much money to do one of these zone changes that not that many people attempt it, at least, you know, compared to other things like dwellings.
So in the side-by-side thesis, as Mike had mentioned earlier, sometimes it becomes a wealth test. You know,
A what test?
A wealth test.
Well,
Yes, it is. It's who can afford
who can buy the
who can
best
afford to
Wealth
do it.
test to provide three experts.
And then the neighbors can't really afford to hire somebody necessarily to try to refute it. And there is nobody else really to do that for you. And so I think the lack of neutrality is the biggest problem, and this site by site, you know, parcel by parcel where they're cherry picking where they're gonna do the testing.
Which would be different than if that review and correction of mapping areas was conducted across the county through a single. Mike, did you have any other comments? So one of the other issues that came up was that, as we discussed earlier today, there is at least a program in place to try to standardize review of soils reports that are used in land use proceedings. There's no such program for foresters reports. So, and we do not review soils reports that are geared towards forest zone.
Who does that?
Nobody.
Counties.
Yeah, it's just.
But you
So-
might, if it's for like a rezone, would you look at it?
So the only things that are reviewed through our soils program are soils reports that involve the definition of agricultural lands. We don't review any of the reports associated with forest lands. Whether it's the forester's report or a soils report for forest lands.
So on the plan amendment, Tamara, where the state gets involved a lot of times, it's not that we're reviewing the soils report saying this, you know, through a program. We may, like the one that we had in Central Oregon, ODA said, yeah, we see your soils report and your experts' reports here. We disagree for the following reasons. And then it's a matter of evidence and it's up to the local government to decide, as opposed to a straightforward process of you've got to do X, Y, and Z to reach this result. Instead, this was a plan amendment process. And so it was our expertise versus their expertise, and the county chooses, and there's no criteria for that. It's just a matter of it, just like any other plan amendment.
And there's no process. So while the Department of Forestry has guidance, they have a technical bulletin on how a site-specific evaluation should be done by a forester. There's no process for determining whether a particular report has been prepared in accordance with that guidance. Dan.
Right, it's muted.
Oh,
Dan, you're muted.
I apologize. I just remembered and wanted to mention before I forget as well, with regard to this data hierarchy and how the, you know, case by case analysis goes, that those Department of Revenue site class maps are only for the west side. So it's also more complicated on the east side, where if the NRCS data doesn't have a measurement or they're trying to dispute it, there's kind of functionally not really any hierarchy for where you go from there, aside from the, you know, contract a qualified professional, with all the issues of that potentially being a wealth test, as we've discussed. So just wanted to mention that as well before I forgot the east side, west side issue.
And John had dropped a comment into the chat, and then we'll go to Kristen. So John, did you have anything to add to sort of that conversation?
I don't think I can.
I think we're not hearing you. What happened?
Did he freeze or he's not talking?
Okay. Why don't we go to Christian and then come back to John for any wrap up?
I just wanted to piggyback on what Mike mentioned about the soil scientists, and then I put my hand up before Lori spoke, and then Lori took the words right out of my mouth. I don't think I I just wanted to echo the sentiment that I think the case by case basis is problematic and really was never authorized. And I think clarifying that the rules need to be clarified so that we don't allow for a case by case basis. There either needs to be county or state review or DLCD, or I think Jim mentioned earlier in the call, ODA, but I just don't think we can have case by case.
Got it. So that. Oh, John isn't a participant, and we would really like to hear from Department of Forestry.
He should be. Okay.
It looks like he's muted.
That's two, I think. Is this him?
That's Mr.
Should be on top.
Fire balance.
You got it locked out.
Okay, was that his giggle?
Oh,
Yeah,
we just heard you.
Was that you, John?
I think we can hear you, John.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Okay, yeah, you're good.
Oh, that's funny. There's no screen image. That's all right. And I might have lost my thread. But I think that to that point, I think that was made earlier, with respect to an established protocol is an underlying challenge, has been pointed out, and I think it was heard informally that I can't remember who made the comment with respect to where you can get that consulting opinion to reflect the interest of the participant, right? So, and to the extent, as you noted, Jim, that goes to the county and that decision making and the capacity to standardize what those reportings are on the basis of the consulting forester is inherently problematic, for all the reasons that are noted. And it would seem that, at least on the west side, that some of the underlying data sources would provide at least a foundation for some sort of secondary confirmation, and if nothing else, a standardized process for some sort of review, which is perhaps, depending on the audience, somewhat salacious to throw out there, but it is that inherent challenge. And then, as Dan pointed out, on the east side, where NRCS doesn't exist, or where there's dark spots on the west side, there's plenty of opportunity for imputing values, which of course came up very significantly in several circumstances. But on the east side, and we Dan's belying some of the past work, there's been an ongoing effort to try to figure out a mechanism with the existing data sources to try to extrapolate rather than impute. But that still seems a bridge too far. But it raises a substantial challenge, but perhaps from a standardizing perspective would provide some benefit. And even though it's perceived as not, the baseline productivity across much of the east side is fairly sufficient relative to the production of trees. And then I would also add in one more factor of consideration there is also the nature of the species and the relative requirements. There tends to be a one size fits all perspective relative to the west side in respect to commercial species, or what measures to that goal 4 perspective. But the reality is that the demands relative to the broader whole of the suite of species oftentimes lowers that threshold substantially. So none of that creates any clarity, but it does underline, I think, the concerns and the challenges that are raised by the capacity to shop for answers, I guess, for lack of a better phrase.
That's how I was thinking. That's exactly right, John. When I was at the Columbia River Gorge Commission, we straddled east and west, so we did both.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember people saying, well, gee, the rating for Douglas fir is too high, so I'm going to go get the rating for Ponderosa pine, shopping for it. We solved that real quick. We just said the rating for all commercial tree species.
Mm-hmm.
And you couldn't just come in and pick one species that was low when we knew that another species, which you could grow on the same soils, would meet the definition. So that shopping around thing is a very valid point. I've seen it happen many, many times. And I mean, The energy folks do it all the time. They're shopping around, whether they want to go to the county for review or the state for review. They're shopping for a jurisdiction. It's just a very common practice.
Yeah.
And with the gorge commissions, did you just use the highest?
We use well, I mean, we could, if the lowest one, we had a definition, so it was 20 cubic feet or whatever. If one of the commercial tree species went beyond that, it was forest land. And what a lot of people don't realize, the definition of prime forest land, if I remember right, is for Douglas firs 80 cubic feet per acre per year. You go to Eanes County, that forest is capable of producing 200 cubic feet per acre per year. I mean, some of the best forest land in the world. And so, I mean, it's not even a close call. Yet we have these people trying to argue it's not forest land. So
Even in Lane County.
Well, and to that point,
A lot of water for
yeah, and I believe that you can get down to 20 and you can still, depending on the species that's being grown, which then comes to this conversation of what is commercial, but regardless, 20 is a good baseline.
Well, I've used 20 for my whole career. I mean, that's always been out there. And of course, some people say 20 is nothing, but it's all relative. 20 on the east side is pretty good.
Yep.
Tree production.
Precisely.
All right, so we are past time, guys. So we're gonna need to wrap up, but what I'm gonna do the same thing as we have in the past. I'm going to endeavor to get the revised matrix out in the next 2 days. And we have our next meeting next week on the 2nd. And so we'll get the matrix for that out before Friday as well. And any additional thoughts, since we had to, cut off here, please email me, today or after this meeting, or, as it occurs to you over the next week. And I'll integrate that into the matrices for folks following along, watching online. Please email me your comments and thoughts as well. We have been getting a lot of other public comments emailed directly in as well. But thank you, everyone. And we'll look forward to our next meeting on November 2nd. We are going to be talking about a whole big variety of issues, but one of the key topics we're going to be talking about are data needs and sort of landscape level analyses. And I would love for folks to sort of think about products that you would like to see in what you think data needs are in sort of producing those products. Right. And we'll look forward to seeing everyone on the 2nd. Right, thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hillary.
Thank you. Hillary, can you remind me, I think it was in the first meeting,